The universe is vast, uncaring, and largely uninterested in the affairs of small, self-important beings scurrying across its surface. But that has never stopped humans from telling stories, because despite all evidence to the contrary, we like to believe that things make sense. And that, dear listener, is where Terry Pratchett comes in. Imagine a world not unlike our own, but riding on the backs of 4 giant elephants standing on an impossibly large turtle, floating through space. A world where stories are living things, reality is a suggestion rather than a rule, and death is a rather charming fellow who speaks in all caps. A world that, against all odds, makes far more sense than the one we live in. Pratchett wasn't just a writer, he was a satirist, a philosopher with a mischievous grin, a man who looked at the absurdity of existence and said, "Right, let's make this even funnier." He understood that the greatest truths hide in the silliest jokes, and that sometimes the best way to understand reality is to wrap it in fantasy and watch it squirm. His books aren't just stories, they're mirrors, held up to the world with a wink and a knowing nod. They ask the big questions. What is justice? What makes us human? Can a cat turn into a dangerously attractive man after one too many drinks? And most importantly, who actually runs the world, and why is it always the people you least expect? So, whether you're here for the philosophy, the comedy, or just to see what happens when wizards get involved in government policy, welcome. We're about to step into a world where logic takes a lunch break, destiny has an attitude problem, and free will is something you'd better hold on to tightly. Because this is Discworld. And now, dear listener, let's turn the page, because as Granny Weatherwax might say, things are about to get interesting.
All right, let's get ready to dive into Terry Pratchett's Witches Abroad. So we're talking witches, obviously, and a trip to a city called Genua. And it's all about fairy tales. But not exactly the fairy tales you might be thinking of.
No, not quite. This book takes those classic stories we all know and kind of twists them in a really interesting way. It makes you think about them in a whole new light.
So how does it all start? Where do the witches come into the picture?
Well, it all begins with the death of this powerful witch, Desiderata Hollow. She leaves her wand and a very specific mission to Granny Weatherwax.
Granny Weatherwax, I can already tell this is going to be good. She doesn't strike me as the type to follow someone else's instructions blindly.
You're right about that. She's not one to take orders easily, but this mission is important. Desiderata wants Granny Weatherwax to stop a young woman from marrying a prince in Genua.
Sounds like a typical fairy tale setup, right?
Oh.
Beautiful maiden, handsome prince, destined to be together. What's the problem with that?
Well, that's just it. It's so typical, so expected. Desiderata is worried about the power of stories on the Discworld. The idea that stories can actually influence the course of events.
Wait, so you're saying fairy tales can actually change things? That they're not just stories?
In a way, yes. It's this concept called narrative causality. Stories become like paths carved into reality. The more people follow them, the deeper they get, and the harder it becomes to stray from the expected course.
That's a bit mind-bending.
Yeah.
So Desiderata is basically sending Granny Weatherwax to disrupt a story that's gone wrong.
Exactly. She sees a dangerous narrative unfolding in Genua, and she's desperate to break it.
So it's not just about preventing a wedding, it's about preventing a potentially harmful story from taking root.
Right.
That's where the journey comes in, right?
Right. And oh boy, is it a journey. These witches face all sorts of challenges along the way. Dwarfs trapped in a mountain, a boat ride powered by exploding pumpkins, even a talking wolf with human thoughts. You know, typical Discworld stuff.
Okay, the talking wolf, I have to admit that one intrigues me. How does a wolf end up with human thoughts? Is there magic involved?
There's always magic involved on the Discworld. But this wolf is more than just a magical creature. He's a symbol of how Pratchett subverts expectations. He takes these familiar fairy tale elements and injects them with something darker, something more thought-provoking.
So the challenges the witches face, they're not just random obstacles, they're part of a larger purpose.
Exactly. They force the witches to confront their own assumptions about magic. about the world.
Yeah.
It's like each encounter is preparing them for the bigger battle ahead in Genua.
Speaking of Genua, we haven't really talked about the city itself. What's it like?
Imagine a city obsessed with beauty and happily ever afters. Everything picture perfect, like walking into a fairy tale.
That sounds delightful. What's wrong with that?
It's all very artificial, very manufactured, like a stage set. It's where Pratchett really starts to dissect those fairy tale tropes and expose the potential harm they can cause.
You're making me think of those perfectly curated social media feeds. Everything looks perfect, but you know it can't all be real.
Exactly. It's that sense of unease, that something's not quite right. It's deliberate on Pratchett's part. He wants us to question those idealized narratives that are often presented to us, especially when it comes to things like happiness and success.
So who's behind this facade of happiness in Genua? Who's pulling the strings?
Enter Lilith, the city's ruler, another powerful fairy godmother. But she's got a pretty twisted idea of how fairy tales should play out.
Oh boy, a fairy godmother with a dark side. I'm sensing trouble already.
Lilith embodies the danger of taking stories too literally and imposing them on others. She's manipulating events, forcing narratives onto people, punishing anyone who deviates from her script.
It's like she's weaponizing fairy tales.
Yeah.
That's a chilling thought.
It is. And it's a reminder that even the most seemingly innocent stories can be used for harm if they fall into the wrong hands.
So we have these witches on a mission to disrupt a dangerous narrative. A city under the spell of forced happiness. And a fairy godmother who sounds more like a villain than a benevolent figure. This is shaping up to be quite a story.
And we haven't even talked about the young woman at the center of it all, Emberella, or Ella for short. She's the one Lilith has chosen for the prince. But Ella is not your typical damsel in distress.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Tell me more about Ella. How does she fit into all of this?
Ella is a fantastic example of how Pratchett subverts those traditional fairy tale archetypes. She's defiant, independent, and she actively rebels against the forced narrative of marrying the prince.
So she's not just going to sit back and let fate decide her future. She's going to fight for her own happiness.
Exactly. She wants autonomy, the freedom to choose her own destiny, even if it means going against the grain of what society expects of her. And her story is just one of the threads that make up this rich and complex tapestry that is Witches Abroad.
It sounds like there's a lot more to uncover in this deep dive, and I can't wait to explore it all with you. So let's jump right in. Last time we were talking about this city, Genua, and this idea that it's all about fairy tales, but like not in a good way.
Right, it's like a fairy tale gone wrong. Everything's too perfect, too controlled.
And we left off with the witches about to go to this big fancy ball, which I imagine is going to be a bit of a shock to them.
Oh, definitely. It's the epitome of everything that's wrong with Genua. This forced merriment, this obsession with appearances.
I can't even imagine Granny Weatherwax in a ball gown. She's so practical, so down to earth.
And yet, there she is, forced to waltz and make small talk. It's actually quite comical to see how she reacts to this whole situation.
So what about the other witches? How do they handle this fairy tale world?
Well, Nanny Og, as you might expect, she just embraces it. She dives headfirst into the food, the drinks, the gossip.
Of course she does. Nanny Og is always up for a good time, no matter the circumstances.
Exactly. And then there's McGraw. She's a bit more caught up in the whole fairy tale fantasy.
McGrath's always been the most romantic of the three. She's the one who believes in true love and happy endings.
Which makes her experience at the ball all the more interesting, because she starts to see the cracks in the facade. She realizes that even in this fairy tale world, things aren't always what they seem.
It's like she's starting to wake up from a dream.
In a way, yes. And it's through her eyes that we start to see the real cost of this manufactured happiness, the way it stifles individuality and creativity.
So the ball is more than just a social event. It's a turning point in the story.
Exactly. It's where the conflict between Lilith's control and the witch's desire for freedom really comes to a head.
And Granny Weatherwax, I bet she's not just going to sit back and watch all of this unfold.
You know, Granny Weatherwax, she's always got a plan. And at the ball, she starts to put that plan into action.
What does she do? Does she try to confront Lilith directly?
Not exactly. She realizes that Lilith's power is tied to this magical clock, the clock that controls the flow of time in Genua.
So she's going to mess with time. That sounds dangerous.
It is, but Granny Weatherwax understands that sometimes you have to take risks to disrupt the narrative, to break free from the expected course of events.
It's like she's challenging fate itself.
In a way, yes. And it's a reminder that even in a world where stories seem to have so much power, we still have agency. We still have the ability to make choices.
But doesn't Lilith have that power too? She's a fairy godmother after all.
Yes, but her power is different. It's based on manipulation, on controlling the narrative. on forcing people to follow her script.
While Granny Weatherwax, her magic is more about understanding the world, accepting its complexities, working with them rather than trying to control them.
Exactly. And that's the fundamental difference between them. Lilith wants to impose her vision of happiness on everyone else, while Granny Weatherwax believes that true happiness comes from freedom, from the ability to make your own choices, even if those choices lead to messy, unpredictable outcomes.
So it's a battle between two different philosophies, two different ways of seeing the world.
And it all culminates in this epic confrontation between Granny Weatherwax and Lilith, a clash of wills, a battle for the fate of Genua.
Okay, now I have to know. What happens? Who wins?
Well, it's not really about winning or losing. It's about disruption, about breaking the cycle, about showing the people of Genua that there's another way.
So does it work? Does Genua change?
It does, but not in a neat, tidy way. It's more like a messy awakening. The city is left in chaos, the illusion of happiness is shattered, and the people are forced to confront the reality of their situation.
That doesn't sound very happy.
No, but it's real, it's honest. And it's a necessary step towards true growth and change.
So it's like Pratchett is saying that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is to wake them up, even if it hurts.
Exactly. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is to break the fairy tale and show them the real world.
It's a powerful message. And it makes me think about all the fairy tales I grew up with. All those happy endings. Maybe they weren't so happy after all.
Maybe not. But that doesn't mean the stories are worthless. They can still teach us valuable lessons. They can still make us think. And sometimes the most important lessons are the ones that challenge our assumptions and make us question everything we thought we knew.
We've been talking about these stories and how they kind of take on a life of their own.
Yeah.
But how literally should we take that? Is Pratchett saying fairy tales are like real magic on the Discworld?
It's not so much that the stories themselves are magic, but they have this effect he calls narrative causality. Like, the more a story is told, the more it shapes the way things actually happen.
It's like if everyone believes a rumor long enough, it kind of becomes true, regardless of whether it started out that way.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. It's as if these stories carve out paths in reality. The more people follow those paths, the more set in stone they become.
So on the Discworld, fairy tales are especially powerful because they've been told and retold for centuries.
Exactly. They've become so ingrained in the culture that they almost act as self-fulfilling prophecies. People expect things to happen in a certain way, so they often do.
That makes what the witches did even more impressive. They went up against that narrative gravity and actually managed to change things.
And that's where Pratchett offers a glimmer of hope. He's not saying we're helpless against these narratives. We can challenge them, subvert them, even create new stories altogether.
But it's not easy, is it? Especially when you have someone like Lilith actively manipulating those stories for her own gain.
You're right about that. Lilith represents the dark side of this idea. The way stories can be used to control and manipulate.
And even though she's defeated, Genua is still left to deal with the aftermath of her influence.
It's like they've been living in a dream, and now they're forced to wake up to reality. It's messy and uncomfortable, but it's also a chance for a fresh start.
So it's not a typical happy ending. It's more like a beginning.
Exactly. It's the start of something new, something real. And that's a far more powerful message than any fairy tale could ever offer.
It makes you think about all those stories we're told about success and happiness. Maybe they're not as straightforward as we'd like to believe.
I think Pratchett is trying to show us that true happiness isn't about following a predetermined script. It's about embracing the complexities, the messiness of real life.
It's about making your own choices, even if they don't lead to a picture-perfect ending.
And that's a really empowering message, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we all have the power to shape our own stories, to challenge the narratives that don't serve us, and to create something new and meaningful.
I think that's what Pratchett would want us to take away from Witches Abroad, to be critical thinkers, to question everything, and to never stop searching for our own truth.
That's a fantastic note to end on. So everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Witches Abroad. We hope you enjoyed exploring the Discworld with us, and we'll see you next time for another literary adventure.